everyone. We're back. Welcome to CEPA's Inside Cyber Diplomacy Redux, where we discuss how policy is shaping the future of cybersecurity technology. We're your hosts, Jim Lewis, who's a distinguished fellow for CEPA's Tech Policy Program, and me, Chris Painter, founding partner of the Cyber Policy Group. And we're thrilled to have you join us today. I know it's been a little delay, but we're back and we're here to stay, and we have a great lineup of guests. In this episode, we have Allison Pytlak from the Stimson Center. And I should note that Allison is, I think, Jim, our first researcher slash think tank person we've had featured in the podcast. So, Allison, kudos to you.
Thank
And
you.
we will discuss a long range of topics. But we also ask you, and we'll ask you again at the end, to subscribe to CEPA's Inside Cyber Diplomacy Redux podcast. And we'll have a new episode regularly this time, unlike last time.
Allison has the good luck or perhaps misfortune to go to all the UN meetings, and we'll be going to the next OEWG. So
Absolutely.
that might be a good start. We'll have your bio on the website, but what do you think is going to happen as we go into the final exciting round of the open-ended working group?
The final
Yeah, the final countdown, right? We're into it now after 4.5 years of this round of the Open-Ended Working Group.
the 5-year Star Trek mission that's coming to an end.
Yeah, although they use a lot of running metaphors. So I guess that we're now over the wall part of the marathon, and now we're kind of getting into like the home stretch there. Um, what do I think is going to happen in July? I mean, I think that the big outstanding questions, it's norms, law, bleeding into regular institutional dialogue, right? And views around the ongoing relevance of the 11 norms, feelings about do we need new international law? Is existing international law sufficient? I feel like this is really impacting the sort of tone and shape of the future permanent mechanism. And I don't know, I assume your listeners know that that is what will get decided on or what needs to get decided on as the
So
successor body.
give us a rundown of the cast of characters. Like, who are the opposing sides? There's at least three sides in this, in particular if you don't count the Singaporean chair. Who's active in these discussions?
Yeah, well, so for a long time, Russia's been championing a new international legally binding framework on cybersecurity, distinct from the new UN Cybercrime Convention, of course. So they and the countries that support them in that's, I guess, one of the camps that you're referring to. I think you've got US, Canada, most of the Western Europeans coming out more and more in support of the program of action proposal.
And I hope we can talk about that later on because you know it pretty well.
Yeah, absolutely. And the program of action, that would be a politically binding instrument, sort of like midway between, I guess, what we have right now and calls for a legally binding instrument. And then you've got a whole lot of other countries, of course. Some of them are, having strong feelings about one or the other options. Some of them, I think, are maybe staying a little bit strategically silent as we move toward the final session.
Yeah, so we have, there are two things that have to happen in this final session. And there's been predictions everywhere from it's going to be a train wreck to everyone's going to think come be more probably on the train wreck side. But they have to do two things. One is to actually come up with a final report, the 5-year wrap-up report. They've done reports every year or for the last 3 years, which I think charitably you could say have demonstrated incremental progress, as the chair likes to say. And incremental is the key word, incremental, like very incremental. But now they have to wrap it all up. And then they have to decide, arguably, and launch this new permanent mechanism. Given the kind of real geopolitical differences going on now and the strains, and even some question of where exactly the U.S. is going to land on all this stuff. What are you hearing? What are you seeing? I mean, of course, we have to wait till July to find out what happens. Whether you think that's likely to come up, I mean, I think it's likely they'll come up with something, but what that something will be. And there's lots of issues on the table, what the groups are going to be, whether stakeholders can participate. What's your thought on all that?
Yeah, there is agreement that something needs to succeed the open-ended working group, that the work can't just stop here. And I think that, for the UN to stay relevant in international peace and security, it needs bodies that can respond to the growing role and impact of all technologies on international peace and security. I think there have been, this conversation about regular institutional dialogue, a future mechanism. It's been happening since the very beginning of this OEWG session, and at times,
Actually, it goes back a decade. So
yeah, it's been
startling progress.
Longer, yeah.
Yes, that glacial melting process speed. No, but so I think at times there's been a feeling that like what they need is some kind of a body or a mechanism or a platform that can better assess impact and implementation of the UN norms and the application of international law. Can that be depoliticized a little bit from the tens of bodies and processes that the UN usually constitutes, where there's a heavy focus on consensus agreements, negotiation, outcome reports, and that sort of thing? It seems that like right now, everyone agrees, yes, we need a future mechanism. Some would like that mechanism to become a launch pad for negotiations on a future legally binding instrument. I think others would like to still find a way for it to be more focused on supporting implementation of the norms, maybe elaborating new ones if we need them, and helping states to to better implement law. But yeah, that mechanism right now, there's a suggestion for different like small thematic groups. There's disagreement over what those thematic groups should cover, the level of access for non-governmental stakeholders to be in those as experts, and so on and so forth.
Jim, you'll be thrilled to know that the draft report, the zero draft the chair put out, includes, I think, the Secretariat listing all the norms that people might want added. So that hasn't gone away.
Chris and I were involved in a very unfortunate project to come up with new norms a few years ago. And my favorite was a norm that people would refrain from hacking pizzerias because of their criticality. That's it's hard.
That sounds like a very New York City priority.
Well, that's where we actually didn't mean Newark, but new norms doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, I mean, there were. I think the way that the UN has handled those proposals, like on the the things that make the internet work, the backbone of the internet, was one that came out of that group, I think, and I thought that was useful. And in fact, the way the UN interpreted that, or the OEWG, was put it under critical infrastructure. It's not particularly to a country, but it might be an example of a cross-cutting one. So I think you can strike a middle ground, but I think that challenge, Allison, you know this well, is that getting other stakeholders outside of states in this process, unlike the ad hoc cybercrime process, which was the bronze standard because people got in, this one, Russia has routinely vetoed every organization that comes to the U.S. practically, and everyone doesn't have ECOSOC status, including Microsoft, including the Tech Accord.
You should explain that, Chris. There's some favored groups, but they're under the different committee.
Right. So you can go through a lengthy Byzantine process to become what's called ECOSOC approved, and then you can participate in a vast number of UN things. But very few go through that process or are accepted through that process. So most companies, most NGOs are outside that process. And so to get in these discussions, the way this was set up, they have to apply, and no state can veto them. And in fact, one state has vetoed many of them, and maybe sometimes two states, and that's been Russia. And that's led to this question, Allison, that if you're going to get into a more implementation mode, this program of action is supposed to be action-oriented. I always laugh a little bit when someone says action-oriented in the UN, but action-oriented. And concrete. You can't really do that without those other stakeholders who actually do.
Although the role of the private sector and NGOs in creating the initial norms in 2015 was basically non-existent. There were certainly calls from the private sector to be allowed to participate. They were routinely ignored. Microsoft organized a meeting once at the German mission. It was a very nice dinner. But at the end of the dinner, they said, and now for the 15 or so or 20 members of the GGE who were in the room, tell us what you're thinking. And there was complete silence because states are reluctant, not just Russia, states are reluctant to bring in the private sector.
I don't know. Allison, I'd be interested in your opinion. I think that's changed, not with Russia, but I think that's changed for some of the other states. But what do you think?
Speaking of chipmunks, did people hear our chipmunk discussion? Do we record that? We can come back to it, but Allison, go ahead.
No, I think it has changed. And like, before I was kind of going full time on cyber, I worked for many years following different UN disarmament processes, also coming out of the first committee, whether landmines, small arms. I spent many years following nuclear NPT meetings. And I remember when the first OEWG was set up in 2019, and we went through this whole situation of stakeholders being vetoed. Like I think 30 groups were denied access to that very first session. I had to say, like, really, in all my years attending UN meetings on other security topics, had never really seen that level of pushback and exclusion happening like that. I think I think it's changed definitely because there are more groups getting in and getting accredited, but there are some holdout countries who don't feel that we should have a seat at the table. And I think the idea of having a voice and not a vote is really critical here. Like we want to be there because we are a stakeholder in the conversation and have a role to play, whether you're a company or a researcher or whatever your role is. I don't think any of us are asking to have a vote at final
But
outcomes.
that's a good slogan, voice but not a vote. But most of our audience will know it's two of the five P5 members who oppose new entrants, and that
And
seems
mostly one.
insurmountable.
Yeah, mostly one though, mostly Russia.
Where do you think the Chinese are in this? I've talked to the Chinese representative several times about this, and I said, why do you care? They're probably going to support you more than they're going to support us. And I think the idea just makes them uncomfortable. But Allison, what's your experience?
Yeah, I haven't spoken with them bilaterally, but I think for watching some other forums, it is as you say. Like I think it's the general idea of multi-stakeholderism and a bigger role for civil society, which, if we're honest, in a lot of forums, it does mean a lot of advocacy groups. So I could see why maybe there's a bit of discomfort there.
Yeah, I think in fairness, they view this as most of the participants, the multi-stakeholder participants, are really Western voices and not
Mhm.
it's a Russian voice. Or the Russia has kind of flooded there's a lot of Russian quote unquote think tanks that are now accredited, which is
True. Yeah.
uh, but those are mostly instruments of the Russian government, or so are they.
Shocking. Yeah.
Well, so whatever happens in July, and it will be, I'm voting for more of a train wreck. Here's what I'm voting for. It will be a train wreck, but everyone will celebrate it as a great victory because they agree on something that doesn't really do a lot. But that's my
My
And then
fear has
and then
always
we'll go to
been
karaoke.
we'll
my
go to
fear has
karaoke.
always been that they'll because you start the pinnacle of this stuff was 2015, and the temptation to reword or dilute or rewrite um, what what came out of those negotiations is a real risk because it will if it's rewritten, it will not be better.
Yeah. Well, the two benefits. I mean, Allison, my view is the two benefits. You brought a lot more countries into the discussion,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and then you didn't backslide. You actually had them affirm the acquis, that the norms and the confidence building measures. So that at least is good. There's been some other, you know, uh, point of contact directories, other things. This idea of a one portal to rule them all, which good luck with that, one running. But that at least I think has been a success. I mean, so I wouldn't say it's not totally, it's been valuable.
No, it's been
Yeah.
progress, and our idea is progress. Regular institutional dialogue is progress, and the discussion of international law is interesting. I don't know if we need new norms, but we probably need more discussion of international law and
And
how it applies.
yeah, and building on that, like I think what has also been valuable about the open-ended working group experience is like Chris, as you said, it's brought so many more countries into the discussion. And like look at the number of national statements or interpretations of
Hmm.
international law that now exist. I think a lot of that can be credited back to open-ended working group and related efforts. There's also been things like the National Survey of Norms implementation from the first OEWG, and now these efforts for checklists, and ASEAN now has their own checklist, which I think is quite cool. So there are these sort of like practical tools and outputs from the open-ended working group. Maybe we're not seeing, big ambitious political decisions, but there has been sort of, I think, a steady output of tangibles.
So not everything, despite the UN thinking everything happens in the UN, not everything happens in the UN. And one other process you've been following has been the Pall Mall process, which has a different focus, a different scope, but it kind of covers some of the same ground. What are your initial thoughts on that? And I know Jim has some follow-up too.
Yeah, I think we've been following the Pall Mall process since it got launched in early 2024, and this has been an effort to bring about some guidelines through a code of conduct that was recently launched in April of this year around commercially available intrusion capabilities. I always get the acronym wrong on that, if it's CICC or CCIC, but anyway, you know what I mean. Um, I think
Spyware.
spyware, yeah. um, I think what's been good about that process is it's able to hone in on a particular threat or type of ICT technology, spyware specifically, because the UN processes, they're always really broad, right? And we might list and name all these different kinds of threats and technologies that we're concerned about in the threats session of the open-ended working group, but trying to get to really, focused solutions or frameworks or efforts, that's harder. And so I think the narrower focus of Pall Mall is good. The code of conduct, the code of practice that was just launched, which is for states. I think the next one that they're going to be doing is for companies and vendors. It references quite extensively different of the norms that it feels are relevant to Pall Mall and the spyware issue. It introduces some of the same principles and references international law that we talk about in the UN. So there is complementarity there. The challenge, of course, is can they grow the number of countries that are supporting it, and will they be held to account?
How many
Or
countries are involved now?
I think they've got just under 30, maybe around 20.
Yeah. And interestingly, the US has come out and still supports it. Unlike some other things, the US has not backed away from that.
I think they didn't sign it, but they did. They've spoken favorably about it
Okay.
When was that?
in April
Like
2024.
recently.
It
Yeah.
doesn't count.
No. They've said something recently, 2025, I
Oh,
think.
okay.
Yeah, sorry. It's 2025. I think they didn't sign the draft code, but they have spoken favorably about the initiative, and they signed the initial declaration when
Who
the
is
process
they?
was launched. The US
But who in the US? Is it state? Is it NSC?
state.
Is it?
Yeah,
Hmm.
I believe it's state.
Okay. Well,
Yeah,
that counts for something.
it does. I mean, there was some question when they didn't sign it whether they approved it, and then at least what I read is that later on they came out and said, "Yeah, we approved this." So yeah, and that got up through the channel, so it wasn't a, you know,
But is this the substantive end of the pell-mell process, or is there more work? Is the work solely recruiting people to sign up, or is there more that it will do?
The next step is to develop another code of practice or code of conduct, but for companies and vendors of spyware. So this first one is only for governments and states. The next one will be for private sector. And I think that's where like people are wondering like, who will you get around the table and how will that look?
yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, you can never, as we all know, you can create processes, but you can never destroy them. So once it starts, it will never end. So, but it could do good things too. So that's important. Um, you also have done some work or been involved in looking at the UN Security Council and how that could maybe be effective, not be effective. I mean, the problem with the UN Security Council is obviously, and not just on cyber, you know, you have people who can veto anything, and they do. And I remember when the U.S. was reticent about ever bringing cyber to the UN Security Council because they just thought it would be a platform for Russia to launch off into their cyber treaty thing. But now it seems to be a regular occurrence. You had the Germans did it, you had the Estonians did it, you have other countries doing it. I think the U.S. even had a discussion about it. Um, so is there any there though? Because at the end of the day, you're still going to have these discussions, but then you have this kind of setup where things will get vetoed by one of the transgressors of norms if you get any further.
Yeah. No, it's obviously it's a very challenging body. It's very polarized, it's very politicized. But you're right, there has been more momentum in the council. Estonia had the first ever high-level open debate. South Korea followed suit last year with that. And there's been, I think, per our research, around like 10 ARIA formula meetings over the years, which are kind of more expert discussions on some very specific topics. They've talked about spyware, they've talked about ransomware, they've talked about use of social media for spreading and promoting online hate and incitement to violence. So there's been actually a lot of pockets of activity. And that's why we were researching this over the last year, was to see, what is the role of the council and how can the council stay relevant increasingly to uphold this mandate of upholding international peace and security at a time when AI and cyber are becoming more and more relevant to that discussion. Um, I think,
All I remember from the first one is the Russians walked out, and because I was there, and
yes.
the lesson they've learned since their last walkout was walk out but preserve your veto. So that I took that as it's useful to have this discussion. It's like the OEWG, we're broadening the depth of knowledge, but we're not actually going to get to any serious agreement through it.
No, and I don't think there's a push to make cyber become like a new priority item for the council. I do think it's important that existing Security Council mandates account for digital and cyber threats. So whether it's protection of civilians or the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, UNSCR 1540 and non-proliferation, I think they need to kind of stay fit for purpose and understand how cyber and digital threats are affecting those mandates. But there's also, I think, a role for the council in reinforcing the applicability of international law and the UN Charter per the framework and what we talk about in the Open-Ended Working Group.
The part that always struck me as a little more sharp was the program of action, the POA, because in the mythology of POAs is they sort of escape the veto process, they escape the consensus process, and they're given that they're more voluntary and more open in participation. We've seen some examples of POAs that have actually, after a decade or so of discussion, led to agreement. So you're sort of I'm a POA fan. The French are a POA fan. Where are you on this?
Yeah, I also liked the idea, and I still do like the idea of a POA because I do feel like it is kind of a good compromise between the framework, which is nothing's wrong with the framework, but it is not really binding in the way that the legally binding instrument might be. So it's sort of,
What's not legally binding?
well, I mean the framework as it is, like international law is binding
Oh,
on states. But I think for proponents of a legally binding treaty, and then those who would like to keep with the status quo of working with existing law and the norms, a POA kind of falls right in the middle as a politically binding instrument, right? So you kind of can maybe make both sides happy. Um, I used to follow the Small Arms and Light Weapons Program of Action, which was also negotiated through the UNGA. And I think that has, and others that I've studied too, I think that they spawn a lot of really, yeah, good practical national and regional level actions in support of a broader goal. They're very specific in how they're written and outlined. Um, the smaller POA though, it has run into problems at its review conferences and its annual meetings and trying to get consensus on an outcome document. I think that's often clouded the good work that's happened on the ground, unfortunately. And so what I had hoped was that if the POA, cyber POA process can go anywhere, that it can kind of learn from the missteps of other POAs and avoid that trap.
what could a company get out of the POA? I mean, what would be the things that you think would be incumbent on the private sector as a result?
Well, I think that's where POAs are good because a lot of the other ones, they've got really specific, I don't say directives, but
Hmm.
steps and actions for different kinds of stakeholders. Like some of them really outline, for example, in small arms and light weapons, it talks about things like marking and tracing of weapons, and who's doing that. Others assign activities and steps to legislators and parliamentarians. So I think a cyber POA could actually be explicit about what is the role of the private sector, what is the role of the research community, what are the role of other relevant actors in a way that we haven't seen before.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's certainly promise in the POA, depending on what the working groups are and how they operate. I think the challenge will be this whole OEWG and processes POA has become so highly politicized now that there's going to be a challenge in actually doing that practical work in the short term, no matter how it's set up. I think some of the proposals about stakeholder involvement, particularly in these working groups, which I think that's where the rubber meets the road. So you'd hope that those have, a fuller array of participants. But as Jim says, it might be a while before they be able to start producing anything that's free of every.
I forget which one it was. It might have been small arms, but in the third GGE, the UNODA representative and I were excused to go to attend the meeting where they agreed on it because we had started working on it as junior officers 15 years earlier. So there's just a hint on timing there. I mean, that was you and Buchanan.
Yeah, I know Ewan.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Of course, the other side is like something like just a total talk shop. Like, I don't want to be too besmirching of it, like the CONUPIS, the Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, where people.
That was always a fate worse than death. If you were assigned to that, it stayed.
So that's the fear that it would just become that. And then, despite the chair saying, well, the fact we're talking at all is a confidence building measure, one of his favorite phrases, what he says again in the zero draft.
It's true. It could be mime. So you got to look on the bright side.
Well, I mean, that brings up something, you've done a lot of research on accountability in cyberspace. You had a big project on this, very interesting report that work continues. This is something that certainly Jim and I talk a lot about, that, whatever, let's not even get into deterrence or not deterrence. How do you actually shape people's behavior in cyberspace? How do you reach that level of accountability that they might change your behavior in the future, whatever you call it? And that's really kind of eluded states so far. They haven't really done things that have changed behavior very much. UN is not, despite the Secretary General's proclamation, when was that, in 2023 or 2024, about creating a UN accountability mechanism, which everyone was like, yeah. The technical term. How can, your report talks about a number of recommendations. That's a number of case studies, and then it talks about using different tools to achieve this. Can you talk a little bit through that and where that's going? Because I think that has continued relevance in the space, because we haven't done a good job in the past, at least in my view. And I think Jim agrees with me.
Oh,
Yeah.
sure. Yeah. But the accountability is really a hard one. So you can have discussions of accountability without actually creating accountability. And that's kind of what we've been doing for some years now.
Maybe.
Yeah, I mean, whether it's in cyber or in life, I think everyone likes the idea of accountability until it's turned on you, right? Like whether it's being held to account to going to the gym after work, or like, not using your cyber weapons. Yeah, no, our research projects that we started, I guess now it's been 3 years ago. We wanted to look at how accountability has worked or not worked in other, domains or threat areas or issue areas. So we did 10 case studies, things ranging from climate and ozone issues, the Montreal Protocol, some outer space agreements, looking at different things from arms control, disarmaments, the Montreux document on private military security companies, and just to try to see, like, across the board, what has worked well, what hasn't worked well. I think it's safe to say that nothing has like got it perfectly, and there are always, violations and transgressions that get away from us. A couple things that we found that did work really well. I think in areas or regimes where you have kind of multiple instruments or multiple tools, you tend to see a lot more impact. So if we looked a lot like arms control, right? It's a huge field, and you have everything from legally binding agreements to CBMs to less formal things. And I think that sort of having that array of instruments tends to lead to greater impact.
We forgot to make fun of CBMs as part of the OEWG process, so maybe we can come back to that.
It is a CBM. Yeah,
All right.
No, but I think what also we lifted up in the research was understanding accountability as like carrots and sticks, so positive and negative. So how do you build incentive for good behavior? How do you build capacity to do all the things that we all need to do to keep our shared cyberspace safe and secure and stable? But also, what are some of the sticks that we have in our collective pockets to punish or for consequences of bad behavior? I think a lot of people think about accountability as just being about attributions. Definitely, attributions have felt like the kind of go-to, maybe coupled increasingly with sanctioning activity too. We had some interesting conversations about attribution in a recent workshop that we did, and sort of the value of public attributions, putting out press statements and so forth, but also the value of using
And the
kind of back.
Czechs just did one this morning. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah. But I think, and I remember in one of our validation workshops for a big report, someone said, well, we're doing a lot of naming, but is there actually any shaming happening? And I think that that's a very valid question to ask. Is the statements are important. I think they help to demonstrate where there's been something that's wrong and draw a line in the sand about what's unacceptable behavior. But I don't know if it's changing behavior, to kind of go back to your earlier question.
Yeah, I mean, the example I always use is when the U.S. came out on Not Petty at the Meeting Security Conference and said, and there will be 6 months after the fact, and there'll be consequences, which, if you're going to wait 6 months, you should have some consequences lined up. But I think you make the point in the report, and correct me if I'm wrong, that one predicate to all of this is it has to be really a no kidding priority for countries at a political level. That maybe one of the things that hasn't worked is that we all say it's a priority, or all the countries say it's a priority, but when push comes to shove, they're not willing to use these other tools, these non-cyber tools, these out-of-band trade and other tools, because it really isn't a big priority. Do you see that, or do you think there's a way?
And maybe to build on that, if you look at earlier agreements on non-proliferation or arms control, this was done at the head of state level ultimately. Who comes to the OEWG meetings? Who comes to the POA? And one thing I've heard, you can both correct me if I'm wrong, is that over time the level of the diplomats attending has gone down. It tends to be representatives from New York rather than from Capitol, and it tends to be more junior, which indicates, to Chris's point, that it's not a priority.
I mean, I think of the OEWG composition, it depends a lot on the meeting. So it always feels like in the July meetings where they're negotiating the reports, you tend to get a bit more senior representation or more expert from Capitol level. And then the one that's always like subsequent to that, usually like in December, it feels like it's a bit quieter, maybe more local representatives, maybe a few more empty desks in the room. But Chris, on your question, this came up in a couple of regional meetings that I've been to lately on attribution, accountability, and deterrence in Europe and in Southeast Asia. Is sort of like, yeah, where does this fall in the broader strategic calculus of states? And is like calling out a country because of something that they're doing on cyber, does it negatively impact other aspects of their relationship? Is something that is better done sort of quietly through their own bilateral or back channel conversations, or is something that they want to kind of put out really upfront and publicly, and then what will be the sort of repercussions and fallout from that? I think it depends on who the adversary is vis-a-vis yourself, your own country, and what that relationship looks like.
So one of the things the U.S. has said recently, it was Mike Waltz, but I think others have said this now too, is that the U.S. Wants to take a more offensive tone, but I mean more in cyberspace, doing it more generally. But in terms of using cyber offensive capabilities to hold adversaries at risk, and I think the example that Waltz had used, and but I think this is not just unique to him. I heard this in the military and others, is planning, quote, I think he said planting time bombs in Chinese infrastructure to hold them at risk so they don't do things to us.
Which, by the way, the Chinese believe we've already done. I don't think we have, but that's what they think.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And if you're paranoid, the fact that you haven't found them just indicates that they're really well hidden.
Which leads to my favorite movie, the conversation with Gene Hackman, where at the end he's tearing apart his house looking for a bug that's not there. But that aside, so there's this willingness to use these more, and I think other countries are thinking of this too. How do you think that affects the kind of accountability formula? Do you think that's really going to substantially help, or do you think that's going to be perhaps, I hate to say escalatory, but things haven't been that escalatory in cyberspace. But do you think this is going to be, one of the tools that's going to be valuable, or is it getting too much street cred or attention?
That's a good question. I mean, I think saying things like that is escalatory, right? And that's kind of the intention is to be sort of provocative and to be a bit, like look at us, look what we got, look what we can do to you. Um, I mean, at the same time, though, like countries have had off declared offensive capabilities for a while, and some, like I'm thinking of Australia here. Like I know they've sort of published like their I want to say like criteria for use, but the guidelines by which they do use their offensive capabilities. So I guess at the same time, this isn't maybe new, and it's just it can feel a bit hyped at the moment.
It is hyped, and that there's never been an incident of escalation. So that's sort of a hint. The other problem is we tend to have a lack of specificity on the targets for pressure. And so the two, in discussions with some American allies, I've suggested going after cryptocurrency and the attack infrastructure, particularly if it's not located in the country itself. So the Russians very often use European or even American servers to launch their attacks. You could attack that with the cooperation of the host nation. You could attack those targets, and I believe FBI has. But how would that? What do you think the reaction would be in the UN if we said we're emptying out your crypto wallet or we're going after your attack infrastructure? The sovereignty issue always complicates things, but what would you say people would, you sit through these meetings, I don't do that anymore. What would they say?
Lucky you. No, okay. I mean, honestly, I feel like a lot of these meetings kind of don't get to that level of specificity. Chris, I don't know if you agree with that, but I think that that does point to questions about, state responsibility, issues of sovereignty, non-intervention, all these sort of things that are critical and core to the framework. And one of the things that I think is challenging with the UN framework for responsible state behavior is that its content is very good, but I think it hasn't been well translated or well communicated outside of the diplomatic community. And so things like this, like this example that you just gave, I think are really good ways to sort of like crystallize and give examples of like how it could operate in action.
Yeah, I wrote for this ASEAN group an op-ed on this that, even among militaries, um, they're not that familiar with the norms or things that have happened to UN. It is the denizens in the basement of the UN, it's international lawyers. But if you're going to and they are political commitments, but if you're going to get more people to actually embrace these and understand it and make it more political level, you got to get industry, the political level of governments, militaries, the people that this is meant to actually apply to in some cases. But the UN's never going to be the perfect place for accountability, right? Not with the current structure, because yeah, and when accountability comes up in these meetings, Jim, it's like it's people with crosses saying don't go there because you're not going to make any progress. You're going to have
What do you think the effect on UN discussions would be if it came out that the US or Australia or the UK or the Dutch, the Swedes, there's a number of countries that have contemplated this. What would the effect be on particularly the rest of the world? Does it undercut our credibility? Does it enhance our credibility? Do we care?
doing what exactly?
So I've decided I'm going to retaliate against something you did.
Like,
And I
okay.
do that by going after the agency, the agency responsible for it. And you could do something minimal like putting Mickey Mouse's face up on a server. You could do something more comprehensive. But what I wonder about is we tend to live in a Western bubble. And what would the reaction be of, say, the Africans or the Latin Americans, South Americans? What are they, if they say, "Oh, you're just doing it too, you're all the same," or is it, "Ah, you deserve that"? What do you think the reaction will be?
No, I think that's a great question, and that's come up in a couple of conversations that I've been in lately about these exact topics. That there is sort of a Western bubble, as often the Western states making attribution statements and kind of finger pointing. But if we're being honest, lots of Western countries are also in this game too.
Mm.
And sometimes that does get raised and that does get pointed out. You've seen China recently making some public attribution statements as well. So there is kind of this question of like, when that gets turned back on those who tend to promote these kinds of things, what will be the reaction? And interestingly, and I think that in all the different UN bodies and conversations that we've been tracking and following, instances like this is actually where I've heard the most interest from states in a role for the Security Council, because that's what could be a sort of differentiated value is if there is an act of aggression, some kind of accountability, that would be a more logical role for the council vis-a-vis the General Assembly. Now, getting that to happen with the veto and everything would likely be impossible, but some states have indicated that that would be maybe the more natural home for taking up an issue like this in the UN.
Where does the POA fit into that? Because you got to escape the Security Council veto.
Yeah, I mean, well, if the POA, it does get established, that's going to be through the General Assembly. I don't get the sense that there's appetite for that to be kind of a judgment-making body. It's more about the practical, action-oriented work of implementing the framework.
And it's consensus again. So,
Yeah.
and you raise an interesting point of how other countries react. I mean, I think it depends on the case, right? In a kind of expanded view of countermeasures, you can respond to an attack, and I think people understand that. But you also have like all the African countries have a common statement on how international law applies in cyberspace, which is a pretty maximal statement. It's basically as I recall, Allison, it's like any intrusion into our systems is a violation. So even if you used their systems as a pass-through, that would be a violation. This idea of being able to do anything, even going after adversary infrastructure, is seemingly off limits. So I think it's still
unless you got permission. So
unless you got permission, right?
There's been examples of that. So it's the old overflight problem.
But you also pointed out in the report, you talked about some carrots. You need to mix carrots and sticks. I mean, is there really any carrot? Let's take Russia. I mean, what carrot do you give to Russia that's going to change their activity? I mean, I guess we could
threaten to
That's
cut
a
off
hard example.
we could threaten to cut off Putin's Botox supply.
I mean, this is the problem. It's a hard. I mean, when you took just not Russia, but Russia, China to a lesser extent, but North Korea and Iran, or the main, at least against the U.S. adversary cyber actors, it's hard to think of carrots or, frankly, sticks that are going to make that much of a difference. And maybe that's why we haven't had much success.
True. And I feel like that cuts across a lot of international security issues, right? Like when I used to work on the landmines treaty, it was the same thing. Like, how do you get countries that are outside of the treaty to play ball and join? And it sort of, no one really came up with an answer.
So Allison, what did we miss? What's your favorite body other than the UN?
I really like working with people at the OAS. I think they're great.
Okay, we'll be sure.
And you've been doing a lot of regional stuff, right? I know you've been traveling a lot on the accountability and other projects. So that's good. Getting the other bodies, I think, helps.
Yeah. Like lately, our work has really been focused on Southeast Asia, and we had a capacity building workshop last month that brought together 5 Southeast Asian governments to build awareness and knowledge on the framework, the applicability of international law. We talked a lot about national attribution mechanisms and frameworks. We heard from the Canadian government on what their methodology is and like at what levels things get decided, which I think was very instructive and interesting to the participants.
Right.
Chris, any final words?
No, it's been great having you. I've seen you for years at these meetings, and so you put in the time, and I think this accountability project is well worth reading. The report and the follow-up to that is certainly something Jim and I discuss and disagree about frequently, but we have spirited discussions. So I thought it was very valuable to hear your input. And you've been a wonderful return guest or for return of the podcast. So thank you for your time.
Thank you for doing that.
Yeah.
No,
and we'll
thank
have
you
to
for
get
having
you
me.
back. Maybe we can get you back after the OEWG. We can make fun of it.
Yeah, we could be the final what's it called, like the postmortem.
And at some point, you have an article, as I do, coming out in this long awaited other handbook on cyber diplomacy.
Yes, gender and cyber diplomacy.
Yeah, we should mention the one that the EU allegedly is publishing. So The Helly and I did, and you were in it. I don't know. We picked diplomats, I think, so I'm not sure who else was in it, but
The other one's out though, right? There's another one that's still forthcoming this
Yeah,
summer.
that one is available on the web, but it hasn't been formally printed up and launched. The EU one,
the EU ran out of money.
yeah, the other ones, the other ones.
That's what they told us. Okay,
So yeah,
great.
But we'll definitely we'll see what happens in July. It should be an interesting interesting thing to watch. If you only
Absolutely.
have one session to go to this year, make this the one.
Yeah, and if not, get on that UN WebTB with your popcorn, and it'll be great.
Thank you, Allison.
Thank you both very much. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Inside Cyber Diplomacy Redux. We're very happy to be back with you all and plan to see you frequently in the future with interesting guests. You can find this podcast wherever fine podcasts are found, including the usual places, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, etc., and on the CEPA website. So thank you again.